Welcome back to Poirot Files. Today we're diving into an intriguing mystery, Hercule Poirot and the stranger who knew everyone's secret. A tale of deception, secrets, and Poirot's brilliant investigative mind. But before that, I want to say, you've shown me so much love and I truly appreciate it. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Grab your coffee and let's get started. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Guest. The rain had softened into a fine mist by the time the last of the guests arrived at Brackenshaw Manor. The great house loomed in the dim evening light, its tall windows glowing with warmth and elegance. Inside, the drawing-room was alive with murmurs of polite conversation, the clink of fine crystal, and the occasional burst of laughter, though there was an undercurrent of something unsaid, something lurking beneath the surface. Hercule Poirot sat near the hearth, his small, compact figure neat as ever. He had refused a brandy, instead cradling a delicate cup of tisane. Captain Hastings, seated beside him, was already on his second glass of port, his keen eyes drifting from guest to guest with vague curiosity. "Good crowd tonight, eh, Poirot?" Hastings murmured. Poirot's moustache twitched. "Indeed, mon ami, and yet one cannot help but sense a discord in the harmony." Sir Reginald Ashworth, a distinguished gentleman with a formidable presence, presided over the room with the ease of a practised host. His wife, Lady Margaret, sat stiffly on the chaise lounge, her delicate fingers pressing absently at the pearls around her throat. The other guests formed small clusters. Evelyn Carrington, the young socialite, charming the ever-dutiful Colonel. Harrington, the reserved Mr. Ingram, Brackenshaw's butler, moving discreetly between them with the quiet efficiency of a man who had seen and heard too much. And then the footman announced him. Mr. Felix Greaves. A hush fell over the room. The man who stepped inside was tall, lean, with a face that could not decide if it was meant to be handsome or cruel. His eyes, sharp and observant, swept across the assembled guests with the air of one cataloguing his prey. He removed his gloves with an air of slow deliberation and smiled, but it was not a reassuring smile. Sir Reginald stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Greaves," he said, after the briefest hesitation, "I must confess I do not recall issuing you an invitation." Greaves chuckled, low and knowing. "No, Sir Reginald, but I was expected nonetheless." The room tensed. Poirot, ever the observer, noted the reactions. Lady Margaret's fingers clenched tighter on her pearls. Colonel Harrington's expression darkened. Young Evelyn's lips parted, as though in recognition, then shut just as quickly. Hastings shifted, uneasily. "Odd fellow," he muttered. Poirot merely sipped his tisane. Greaves moved to the drinks cabinet, pouring himself a brandy as though he owned the place. He turned, holding up the glass in a mock toast. "It is quite the assembly tonight. Old friends, new acquaintances, and, of course, secrets. So many secrets in this room." Lady Margaret let out a small gasp, barely audible. The butler, moving past, nearly dropped his tray. Sir Reginald's voice was sharp. "Mr. Greaves, if you are here to disrupt my gathering, I will have to—" "Oh, Sir Reginald," Greaves interrupted, his tone amused. "Do not trouble yourself. I am merely here to enjoy the evening. After all, what is life without a bit of truth coming to light?" Silence stretched, brittle and uneasy. Poirot's gaze flickered across the room, noting every shift, every shadow. The little grey cells were already at work. Dinner was served, but the mood remained strained. Conversation ebbed and flowed with forced civility. Greaves, for his part, was effortlessly at ease. He leaned toward Lady Margaret at one point, murmuring something that turned her pale. He chuckled knowingly at a private comment to Colonel Harrington, whose response was a clenched jaw and narrowed eyes. Poirot did not eat much. He was more interested in the way Greaves moved, the way his words stirred something unspoken in each guest. There was an art to it, a puppeteer plucking at invisible strings. When the meal concluded and the guests returned to the drawing-room, Sir Reginald had lost his patience. "Mr. Greaves," he said coldly, "I do not know what game you are playing, but I will not have my home turned into a stage for your theatrics." Greaves swirled his brandy, watching the firelight dance against the glass. "Oh, Sir Reginald, this is no game. I simply believe in honesty." He glanced around the room, eyes lingering on each guest in turn. "And secrets, you see," he said softly, "have a way of coming to light, whether one likes it or not." The clock chimed. Midnight. Poirot set down his cup. Hastings swallowed hard. The tension in the room was suffocating. Outside, the wind howled. Chapter 2. A sudden death in the night. The morning sun was pale and reluctant, struggling to break through the thick mist that clung to Brackenshaw Manor. The house, which had hummed with tension the night before, now lay in an uneasy silence. Poirot rose early, as was his habit, and found Hastings already dressed, standing by the window with an expression of mild concern. "Something feels off, Poirot," Hastings said, rubbing his chin. "Last night, Greaves, there was something in the way he spoke, the way everyone reacted to him. I didn't like it." Poirot buttoned his waistcoat with methodical precision. "And yet, mon ami, it is often those we do not like who prove the most instructive." Downstairs, the household was beginning to stir. The clatter of china from the dining room indicated that breakfast was being laid, and faint voices drifted through the corridors. It was just as Poirot and Hastings stepped out of their room that the first scream shattered the morning calm. Poirot was already moving. The library door was ajar, and Lady Margaret stood just beyond it, her face white, her hands trembling. Sir Reginald was beside her, his expression dark with something between horror and resignation. Inside, sprawled in a high-backed leather chair, was Felix Greaves. Even in death, there was something disquieting about him. His body was slumped slightly. To one side, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. One hand rested limply on the armrest, while the other lay on the desk near a glass, half filled with amber liquid. His skin had taken on a peculiar pallor, and his eyes, though unseeing, still held the faintest trace of mockery. Hastings exhaled sharply. "Good Lord." Poirot stepped forward, every movement precise, every detail absorbed. He did not touch the body, but let his gaze travel over it, noting the faint bluish tinge around the lips. The glass on the desk had been disturbed, the liquid within slightly cloudy. And there, by the fireplace, a charred scrap of paper clung to the grate, its edges curling inward like the remnants of a whispered secret. Sir Reginald's voice was tight. "We should send for the police." Poirot turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Mais oui, they must be informed. But until they arrive, I must ask, who was the first to discover the body?" Lady Margaret swallowed. "The maid, Alice. She came to tidy the room, saw him and ran to fetch us." Poirot's gaze flickered to the door. "And the door, it was locked?" Sir Reginald frowned. "No, it was ajar, just as you see it now." "Curious." Poirot leaned in, studying the dead man's features. "And last night, at what time did the guests retire?" Sir Reginald hesitated. "It was late, close to midnight." Midnight. Poirot's fingers tapped lightly against his sleeve. And Mr. Greaves, he was last seen? Lady Margaret spoke this time, her voice barely above a whisper. He remained here, after the rest of us had gone to bed. Poirot moved to the fireplace, retrieving the burnt scrap of paper with a careful handkerchief. The edges crumbled at his touch. Whatever had been written there was lost, except for a single inked letter that had not yet been consumed by the flames. An R. Hastings frowned. Someone tried to destroy it. Mais bien sûr, Poirot murmured. And yet, mon cher Hastings, fire is not so thorough a friend as one might wish. A footstep in the hallway. Poirot turned as Evelyn Carrington appeared in the doorway. She was pale but composed, her gloved hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Is it true?" she asked, voice steady but too carefully so. "He's dead?" Poirot inclined his head. Evelyn inhaled sharply, but did not look away from the body. Hastings cleared his throat. "Miss Carrington, did you see or hear anything unusual last night, after Mr. Greaves remained behind?" She hesitated, a flicker of something passing over her face. I did hear something." "Ah." Poirot stepped closer. "Pray, mademoiselle, be precise." Evelyn's hands clenched tighter. "I heard footsteps in the corridor near my room. They stopped outside my door for a moment, then moved away." Poirot studied her. "And at what time was this?" She swallowed. "I can't be certain. Perhaps an hour past midnight?" Poirot nodded, then turned back to the body. He gestured toward the glass of brandy. "Sir Reginald, did Mr. Greaves serve himself this drink?" Sir Reginald's brows furrowed. "I assume so." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "But you do not know?" The older man hesitated. "No, I do not." Poirot sighed, stepping back. "We must not disturb anything further. The police must do their duty." Hastings exhaled. "Poirot, you already have an idea, don't you?" Poirot merely smiled. "Mon ami, an idea is like a seed. It must be watered before it may bloom. For now we wait and observe." Outside, the sound of approaching hooves and carriage wheels signalled the arrival of the police. The game, it seemed, had only just begun. Chapter 3, The House of Secrets. The arrival of the police cast a solemn hush over Brackenshaw Manor. Officers moved briskly through the hallways, taking statements, sealing off the library, and ensuring that no one left the premises. Inspector Morton, a stout man with a grizzled moustache and a no-nonsense air, took charge. He greeted Poirot with a curt nod, acknowledging the detective's reputation, but making it clear that official proceedings would follow his command. Poirot, ever the diplomat, inclined his head. "Mais oui, Inspector, the law must have its due. But you will permit, perhaps, that I exercise my little grey cells in parallel?" Morton grunted. "So long as you share anything of interest?" Poirot's moustache twitched. "You will find, Inspector, that I am always most generous with my findings." The guests were gathered in the drawing-room, each absorbed in their own thoughts, or perhaps their own fears. Poirot surveyed them carefully before beginning his inquiries. He turned first to Lady Margaret, who sat stiffly in a high-backed chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. The faintest tremor betrayed her composure. "Madame, I must trouble you with some questions." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I understand." "You were seen in conversation with Mr. Greaves last night," Poirot began, his tone mild. "And it was not, I think, a friendly exchange?" Her lips tightened. "I will not deny it. Felix Greaves was a vile man. He delighted in stirring discord. He—" She hesitated, then exhaled. He said something cruel, something meant to hurt me. I told him I wanted nothing more to do with him, and I left. What did he say, madame? She hesitated. It is of no consequence now. On the contrary, madame, it is of great consequence. A long pause. Then finally, she relented. He insinuated that I had been unfaithful to my husband. Her voice trembled, but she lifted her chin defiantly. It was a lie. Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. And your husband, did he hear these accusations? Lady Margaret glanced towards Sir Reginald, who stood by the fireplace, his face carved in stone. No, but Felix had a way of making sure his poison spread. Poirot nodded, filing this away. He shifted his attention to Evelyn Carrington, who was staring into the distance, lost in thought. When Poirot addressed her, she started slightly, then smiled. A tight, guarded thing, mademoiselle. It has been suggested that you too had reason to resent Mr. Greaves. Evelyn laughed softly, though there was no mirth in it. Felix collected secrets the way others collect rare books or fine wine. He was fascinated by people's misfortunes, especially mine. Poirot tilted his head. Because of a particular scandal, n'est-ce pas? She stiffened. If you must know, yes, there was an affair, a foolish thing when I was younger. Felix knew about it and took every opportunity to remind me of my indiscretions. Poirot's gaze sharpened. And last night, did he remind you again? Evelyn's hand curled against the arm of her chair. Yes, he made some remark, so casual yet so cruel, it was as if he delighted in watching me squirm. Poirot nodded slowly. Did you leave the room before or after, Lady Margaret? After. And did you return to your room directly? A hesitation, almost imperceptible. Then, yes. Poirot's gaze lingered on her a moment longer before moving on. The butler, Mr. Ingram, stood by the door, his usually impassive face lined with worry. Poirot gestured for him to step forward. Monsieur Ingram, you have served in this house for many years, n'est-ce pas? Yes, sir. His voice was steady, but his fingers twitched against his uniform. You were present last night. You saw how Mr. Greaves delighted in provoking the guest. A flicker of something, perhaps distaste, perhaps fear, crossed the butler's face. Mr. Greaves had a particular way of speaking, sir. He enjoyed making people uncomfortable. Did you observe anything unusual after the guests retired? Ingram hesitated, then cleared his throat. I heard footsteps in the corridor. It was well past midnight. Poirot's brows lifted. Whose footsteps, monsieur? I cannot say for certain, sir, but I did see a shadow moving at the end of the hall. Poirot's gaze sharpened. A shadow? Near which room? Ingram's. Adam's apple bobbed. Near Miss Carrington's, sir. Poirot turned back to Evelyn, whose face remained carefully neutral. Hastings shifted beside him. Dash it all, Poirot, you don't think— Poirot held up a hand. Patience, mon ami. He surveyed the room once more. Each person before him had a reason to despise Felix Greaves. But who had hated him enough to kill? The brandy had been tampered with. The burnt scrap of paper suggested a secret destroyed in haste. And the shadow outside Evelyn's room. Poirot clasped his hands together. The murderer is here, among us, he said softly. And I will find them. Chapter 4. The cryptic letter. The discovery of the letter changed everything. It was Hastings who found it, tucked neatly inside the inner pocket of Greaves' coat, which had been draped over the back of the chair where he had met his untimely end. The envelope was crisp, unmarked, save for Poirot's name written in a precise hand. Hastings turned it over in his fingers, his brows furrowing. "Strange thing to carry around on the night one is murdered," he muttered. Poirot took the envelope delicately, weighing it in his hands as if it might reveal its secrets through touch alone. He slit it open with a swift motion, extracting a single sheet of fine stationery. The words, penned in dark ink, were stark against the paper. "The past never stays buried." There was no signature, no indication of when or where it had been written. Poirot read it twice, his expression inscrutable. Hastings peered over his shoulder. "Sounds rather like the sort of thing one finds in a cheap detective novel. Probably meant to be dramatic." Poirot tapped a finger against his lips. "No, mon ami, this is no mere theatrics. Monsieur Greaves wrote this for a reason, and yet—" He held the letter up to the light, scrutinizing it with the keen eye of a jeweler examining a rare stone. Why was it sealed? If he intended to give it to me, why not hand it over at once? Perhaps he meant to, but never got the chance, Hastings suggested. Poirot inclined his head. A possibility, certes, but the phrasing never stays buried. It suggests knowledge, a truth long hidden. But now, at risk of resurfacing, that is what frightened our Monsieur Greaves. Hastings frowned. Then the question becomes whose past? Poirot folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. He glanced at Inspector Morton, who had been observing with sharp-eyed curiosity. "A most interesting development, n'est-ce pas, Inspector?" Poirot mused. Morton rubbed his chin. "A cryptic message, to be sure. But what does it mean?" Poirot gave a small smile. "Ah, that is what we must uncover." He turned to survey the room once more, his gaze settling first on Sir Reginald and Lady Margaret. The latter still sat rigid, her hands clenched together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Evelyn Carrington had moved to the window, gazing out into the grey morning, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. The butler, Mr. Ingram, stood discreetly in the background, his posture tense. Poirot stepped forward. "Mesdames et messieurs, I must trouble you further. Monsieur Greaves wrote a message before he died, a message that suggests the motive for his murder lies in the past, a past perhaps that someone here would rather forget." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Sir Reginald exhaled sharply. "A damnably vague statement. What past? Greaves was always prying into matters that were none of his concern. He had a habit of collecting information and using it when it suited him." "Indeed," Poirot agreed, "and perhaps this time he collected." "Something too dangerous?" His gaze flickered to Lady Margaret, who avoided his eyes, then to Evelyn, who had turned back from the window, her expression guarded. Hastings cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should consider what we already know. We have a man who, by all accounts, delighted in knowing others' secrets. We have an argument. Between Lady Margaret and Greaves, we have Miss Carrington, whom Greaves tormented with scandalous reminders, and we have this letter hinting at something long buried. Could it be that he planned to expose something that cost him his life?" Poirot gave a small nod of approval. "Très bien, Hastings. It is precisely that line of thought we must pursue." He turned his attention back to the group. "Let us consider, then. What might Monsieur Greaves have known that was worth killing for?" Silence. A charged, waiting silence. Then at last, Evelyn spoke. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "He spoke to me last night, before dinner. He was in a peculiar mood, even for him. He said something about old ghosts, that they had a way of returning when one least expected them." Poirot leaned forward slightly. Old ghosts, mademoiselle? She hesitated. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed he was referring to my past, or perhaps someone else's. But now, she glanced at the letter in Poirot's hand, I wonder if he knew something he wasn't meant to. Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. And did he say anything more specific? She shook her head. No, but I had the feeling. She hesitated again. He was amused, as if he held some great secret over someone. Poirot absorbed this, then turned back to the others. Monsieur Greaves was poisoned, a most deliberate method of murder. It suggests a certain calculation. And yet this letter, it suggests that he knew he was in danger, that he anticipated something. Hastings frowned. Then why drink the brandy? Perhaps because he trusted the one who gave it to him, Poirot murmured. There was a pause. The implications of that statement hung in the air. Poirot straightened. I must look further into Monsieur Greaves's affairs. There may be something, a letter, a journal, a note, that sheds light on what he meant by the past never stays buried. And in the meantime, mes amis, I suggest you consider this. The murderer is among us, and secrets have a way of revealing themselves, no matter how deeply they are buried. Lady Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she lifted a handkerchief to her lips. Sir Reginald stood rigid, his jaw tight. Evelyn lowered her gaze, while Mr. Ingram stared at the floor. Poirot watched them all, his mind already fitting the pieces together. Chapter 5. A curious incident at midnight. The revelation of the letter had cast a long shadow over the household, but Poirot knew that the past was not the only thing refusing to stay buried. There were movements in the present, small, deliberate, and secret, that suggested the murderer was not yet finished. It was early in the afternoon when the maid, Agnes, hesitantly approached Hastings and Poirot in the drawing-room. She was a slight girl, with nervous eyes that darted about as if she feared being overheard. "Sir," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but after what happened, I thought maybe it mattered." Poirot gave her an encouraging nod. "Mademoiselle, it is often the smallest detail that matters the most." "You will oblige me by speaking freely." She twisted the edge of her apron. "It was last night, after everything happened. I couldn't sleep, sir. I got up to fetch a bit of water, and as I was passing by the library, I heard something, footsteps. But not coming from inside. They were outside the room, moving down the corridor." Hastings frowned. "After midnight, you say? But the body was discovered well before then." Agnes nodded. "Yes, sir. That's why I thought it was strange. No one should have been near there at that hour." Poirot regarded her keenly. "Did you see who it was?" She shook her head. "No, sir, I didn't dare look. But I waited just behind the staircase, and after a moment, the sound stopped. Then I heard a door close, quietly, like someone was being careful." Poirot clasped his hands together. "A most curious incident indeed. Tell me, ma petite, was there any other sound? A rustling of paper, perhaps, or the faint click of a key?" "In a lock?" Agnes blinked, considering. "Now that you mention it, sir, there was something, a sort of soft scraping, like wood against wood." "Très bien," Poirot murmured. He stood. "Come, Hastings, we must return to the library." The room had been tidied somewhat since the morning's investigations, but Poirot's eyes, sharp as ever, missed nothing. He crouched near the door, examining the carpet closely. A fine layer of dust had settled at the edges of the floorboards, a detail the ordinary eye might overlook. Poirot, however, saw what others did not. Regardez, Hastings, he said softly. Do you see? Hastings squinted. I see a bit of dust, yes. Poirot sighed. And yet, mon ami, you do not see at all. He pointed. The dust here, near the door, it is disturbed. And yet, beyond that, there is another mark leading away. An extra set of footprints. Hastings knelt beside him, now able to make out the faint impressions in the dust. Then someone returned to the crime scene, he said. But why? Poirot straightened. A most excellent question, Hastings. Why indeed? He moved to the desk where Greaves had been found. His hands, precise and deliberate, traced the edge of the drawer. He tugged it open, studying its contents. You recall, mon ami, that we searched Greaves' possessions this morning, we? Yes, of course, and we found a watch, a pen, and his personal papers. But there was something else, was there not? Hastings frowned. There was a small key. Ah, he started. It's missing. Poirot nodded. Precisely. And I do not think it was removed before his death. This, he gestured to the disturbed dust, suggests that someone, after the murder, returned to take it. But what did it open? Poirot pursed his lips. That, Hastings, is what we must discover. They stepped back into the corridor. Poirot cast a sweeping glance down its length before turning to Agnes, who had remained anxiously near the door. Mademoiselle, do you know of anything belonging to Monsieur Greaves that required a key? Agnes hesitated. He had a travelling case, sir. One of those with a lock. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And where is this case now? In his room, sir. Without wasting another moment, Poirot strode toward the guest quarters, Hastings at his heels. Greaves' room was modest, with a neatly made bed and a single suitcase resting on a stand near the wardrobe. Poirot approached it immediately. He examined the lock. It was small, the sort that required a specific key, one that was now missing. Locked case, Hastings murmured. And now the key is gone. That can't be coincidence. No, Poirot agreed. It means that whatever was inside, someone wanted very much to keep it from us. Could we force it open? Poirot gave him a reproachful look. Hastings, such methods are most uncivilized. But surely, Poirot held up a hand. Patience, mon ami. There are always other ways to uncover what one seeks. He turned back to Agnes. Mademoiselle, do you recall if Monsieur Greaves carried his key on his person at all times? She nodded. Yes, sir. I saw him use it just yesterday evening, before dinner. Ah. Poirot tapped a finger to his temple. Then, my dear Hastings, we must ask ourselves, what did he place inside his case that night? And more importantly, who knew about it? Hastings exhaled. And now that the key is missing, whatever it was, we may never know. Poirot's expression was unreadable. Perhaps, Hastings, but one does not commit murder to steal something unimportant. No, I believe that whatever was inside this case, it was worth killing for. He turned sharply, addressing Agnes once more. Did Monsieur Greaves seem uneasy when you last saw him? She considered this. Now that you mention it, sir, he did seem a bit on edge. He asked me a strange question, and that was. He asked if anyone had been in his room when he was out. I told him no, not that I knew of, but he didn't seem convinced. He locked his case after that. Poirot's eyes flashed with understanding. Then he knew someone was after whatever he had. And now it's gone, Hastings muttered. Along with the key, Poirot straightened. For now, mon ami, but a secret, once uncovered, never stays hidden for long. We shall see to that. As they left the room, Poirot's mind was already turning over the facts, weaving the disparate threads together. Someone had returned to the crime scene after midnight. Someone had taken the key, and whatever lay inside Greaves's locked case, it was the reason he had died. The past had returned to claim him. Now Poirot would make sure it claimed the murderer as well. Chapter 6. The first red herring. The air in the drawing-room was thick with tension. Sir Reginald, usually so composed, sat stiffly in the armchair, his hands gripping the arms as if they might keep him anchored. His face, ruddy with suppressed agitation, twitched ever so slightly at the corners of his mouth. Poirot watched him carefully, his gaze keen, his hands steepled beneath his chin. "I suppose," Sir Reginald said at last, his voice measured but heavy, "that I must tell you the truth." Poirot said nothing. The silence between them stretched, an invitation for Sir Reginald to continue. Hastings shifted beside Poirot, barely concealing his impatience, but Poirot, as always, remained composed. The older man exhaled sharply. "Greaves came to see me the evening before he was killed. He had certain information about my business."
Affairs. Information he threatened to expose. "Ah," Poirot murmured. "And if he had done so, it would have been most unfortunate for you, no?" Sir Reginald's jaw tightened. "More than unfortunate. It would have ruined me." "How so exactly?"
The baronet hesitated, his fingers tapping once against the armrest before stilling. "It is not something I care to discuss, but I see I have little choice. Some years ago I entered into business arrangements that, while not illegal, could be misinterpreted. If Greaves had gone to the press, the scandal alone would have destroyed my reputation."
"And so," Hastings interjected, "you had a very strong motive to ensure he kept silent." Sir Reginald's head snapped toward Hastings. "Are you accusing me of murder, sir?" "Not at all," Poirot interrupted smoothly. "But it is curious that you
chose to share this now, after denying any prior conflict with the deceased." Sir Reginald's face darkened. "I knew how it would look, and you can think what you like, but I did not kill Greaves." Poirot regarded him thoughtfully. "Perhaps not. But tell me, monsieur, what did Greaves wish in exchange for his silence?" The baronet's mouth thinned. "Money, of course, a sum I was not prepared to pay." "And yet you are a man of considerable means," Poirot observed. "That is precisely why I did not pay," Sir Reginald snapped. "If I had given in once, he would have returned for more." Poirot tapped a finger against his chin. "A most practical reasoning, and when you refused, what then?" "He was furious," Sir Reginald admitted. "But he left. I assumed he would find some other way to exploit his knowledge." His gaze turned cold. "And now, I suppose, that knowledge has died with him." Poirot did not reply immediately. He studied Sir Reginald for a moment longer, then rose. "Merci, monsieur. That will be all for now." The baronet's brows lifted in surprise. "That's all? You don't find my confession damning?" Poirot allowed himself a small smile. "It is most enlightening, but I do not believe you are our murderer." Reginald's face slackened with visible relief, though he attempted to mask it. Hastings, however, looked perplexed. As they stepped into the corridor, Hastings lowered his voice. "Poirot, I should think that was rather clear proof of motive. Why dismiss it?" "Ah, mon ami," Poirot chided gently. "It is too clear, too convenient. It is a gift wrapped with a bow, an obvious culprit with an obvious reason. But let us consider, would a man in Sir Reginald's position, knowing the very scandal he wished to avoid, commit a murder so close to home?" Hastings frowned. "When?"
"You put it that way. Exactement." Poirot's tone was decisive. No, Hastings, Sir Reginald is not our killer, but I suspect the truth lies elsewhere in this house. They turned toward the library, where Inspector Morton awaited them.
The man stood near the fireplace, his arms crossed, a deep furrow in his brow. At his feet lay a small metal tray, upon which rested several charred fragments of paper. "Your instincts were right, Poirot," he said. "Our expert managed to reconstruct some of this. It wasn't easy. Most of it was reduced to ash, but we found enough to identify what it once was." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "And?" Morton exhaled. "A list of names." Hastings blinked. "Names?" "Yes," Morton nodded. "And from what we can tell, all of them belong to the people in this house." A charged silence followed his words. Poirot, his expression unreadable, extended a hand and took one of the preserved fragments. The ink, faded and smudged, was just legible enough to make out part of a name. "Davenport," Poirot murmured. He turned to Hastings. "The housekeeper." Morton nodded grimly. "Her name, along with Sir Reginald's, Mr. Rhodes, Miss Lytton's, even the maid Agnes, they were all there." Hastings ran a hand through his hair. "But what does it mean? Why? Was it burned?" Poirot was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the charred remains with a deep, inward focus. Then he turned to Morton. "Tell me, Inspector, did your expert determine if there was anything else on the list? Any annotations, marks, or additional notes?" Morton hesitated. "There were a few ink smudges near some names, perhaps check mark or numbers, but they were too far gone to be certain." Poirot nodded slowly. "A pity, but even so we now know this much. Someone did not wish for this list to be found." "Do you think Greaves wrote it?" Hastings asked. Poirot considered this. "It is possible, but if so, why burn it? If it was meant as a record, he would have kept it hidden. If it was meant as leverage, he would not have destroyed it himself." Hastings' brow furrowed. "Which means someone else did. Exactement." Poirot glanced back at the remnants of the list. "And I would very much like to know who." Morton shifted. "We could question everyone. See if they admit to seeing it before it was burned." Poirot lifted a hand. "Non, mon ami, that would put our culprit on guard. Instead, we shall proceed delicately, we shall observe, and most importantly, we shall listen." He turned toward the door, his expression set. "The answer," he said, "is closer than we think." As they stepped out, the distant sound of the grandfather clock chiming filled the silence. Somewhere in the house, a secret still waited to be uncovered. And Poirot was determined to find it. Chapter 7. The Butler's Secret, the faint chime of... The grandfather clock echoed through the dimly lit hallway as Poirot and Hastings descended the staircase. The weight of their findings pressed upon them, but Poirot's mind was elsewhere. His gaze flickered with curiosity as he noticed a familiar figure moving swiftly toward the servants' quarters. Mr. Ingram, the butler. The man's usually impeccable. Composure was absent. His shoulders were rigid, his step hurried. Poirot's keen eyes caught the slight tremor in the hand that clutched a folded letter. Hastings, noticing Poirot's sudden pause, followed his gaze. "Ingram seems troubled," Hastings muttered. "Oui, mon ami, and I should very much like to know why." Poirot adjusted his cuffs and strode forward with purposeful grace, his shoes making no sound against the polished wood. Hastings hurried after him as they entered the butler's small office, catching the man just as he was reaching for his coat. Ingram startled, his usual impassivity cracking for a fraction of a second before he smoothed his expression. "Monsieur Poirot?" he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Captain Hastings, is there something you require?" Poirot's gaze fell to the letter in the butler's hand. Perhaps it is not what I require, but what you intend, Monsieur Ingram." The butler hesitated, then placed the letter upon the desk, with deliberate care. "I do not know what you mean, sir." Poirot stepped closer. "You are leaving, n'est-ce pas?" A long silence stretched between them. Then, with an exhale, Ingram straightened his back. "Yes, monsieur. I intended to submit my resignation immediately." Hastings blinked. "In the middle of a murder investigation? That's highly irregular." "Irregular or not, I believe it to be necessary," Ingram said stiffly. Poirot studied him, his sharp gaze seeing beyond the surface. "Monsieur, a man does not abandon his post without reason, especially a man such as yourself, orderly, meticulous. You have served this household for many years, have you not?" "Indeed." "And yet, on this particular day, you choose to flee." Ingram swallowed. "I am not fleeing." Poirot's voice softened. "But you are afraid." A flicker of something, pain perhaps, crossed the butler's face before he concealed it. "It is no
secret that a murder occurred, monsieur. One cannot blame a man for wishing to avoid scandal."
Poirot shook his head. "No, monsieur, it is more than that. You are running from something else." Hastings folded his arms. "If you know something about Greaves' murder, Ingram, you had best speak now." The butler's fingers twitched, betraying
unease. Then, with great reluctance, he sat down. "There is something," he admitted, his voice low. "But I swear to you, it has nothing to do with murder." Poirot nodded encouragingly. "Go on." Ingram's gaze flickered toward the door, as if ensuring
no one else was listening. "I knew Mr. Greaves," he confessed at last. "Not well, but enough. It was many years ago in another household. I was employed at the time by a distinguished family, the Wycliffes." Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. "The name is familiar." "As it should be," Ingram said grimly. "It was a scandal that made the papers for weeks. A young woman, Miss Eleanor Wycliffe, disappeared without a trace. The police searched, but she was never found." "And Greaves?" Poirot prompted. "He was a footman." "In the household at the time," Ingram said. "A man of sharp wit and sharper ambition. But there was always something about him, something calculating." Hastings frowned. "Do you believe he had something to do with the girl's disappearance?" Ingram hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know this. He was the last person seen speaking with her the night she vanished." Poirot tapped his chin. "Intriguing. And tell me, monsieur, why have you never mentioned this before?" The butler's face tightened. "Because it was so long ago, and because I had no proof. After the scandal died down, I sought employment elsewhere. I had no desire to be associated with such a tragedy." "But then," Poirot murmured, "Greaves reappeared."
"In your life?" Ingram nodded. "When I saw him arrive here as Sir Reginald's guest, I could scarcely believe it."
He had changed little, only grown more self-assured, more ruthless. I do not know why he was here, but I knew that no good would come of it." "And yet," Hastings interjected, "you did not warn anyone." Ingram's expression darkened. "I had no right to. Without evidence, what was I to say? That an old footman had once been seen with a woman who disappeared years ago? It would have meant nothing." Poirot leaned forward. "And yet, now that Greaves is dead, you choose to resign." "Why?" The butler stiffened. "Because I fear that someone
else remembers what I know? And if this murder is connected to Eleanor Wycliffe—" His voice faltered, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Poirot regarded him for a long moment.
"You believe that the killer might come for you next?" Ingram swallowed hard. "I cannot say, monsieur. but I do not intend to wait and find out." Poirot studied the man, noting the beads of sweat at his temple, the tension in his jaw. Ingram was
no fool. He truly believed himself in danger, and that, in itself, was most telling. Poirot rose, straightening his cuffs.
"Monsieur Ingram, I will not ask you to stay, but I will ask one final question." The butler looked up warily. "If Greaves was indeed involved in Miss Wycliffe's disappearance," Poirot said softly, "then tell me, who else in this house would—"
"Have known?" A long pause. Then Ingram exhaled. "Miss Lytton," he said at last. "She was a distant cousin of the Wycliffes. She was there when Eleanor vanished." Poirot's gaze sharpened. As they left the office, Hastings let out a low whistle. "Good Lord, Poirot, do you really think this murder could be tied to a disappearance from years ago?"
Poirot's eyes gleamed. "The past, Hastings, has a way of reaching into the present, and I suspect that before this case is over, we shall uncover secrets long buried." He paused at the foot of the grand staircase, his expression unreadable. "Miss Lytton," he murmured. "Yes, mon ami, I believe it is time we had a conversation with her." Chapter 8. The Poison Dilemma. The drawing-room was hushed, the air heavy with expectation, as Poirot stood by the drinks cabinet. The brandy decanter gleamed under the chandelier's glow, its contents untouched since Greaves' untimely demise. Poirot's fingers hovered over the glasses arranged neatly on the tray. Somewhere in this very room, death had been poured. Hastings watched as Poirot's keen gaze swept the arrangement before him. "I say, Poirot, you've gone awfully quiet." Poirot did not look up. "Regardez, mon ami, the glasses, each one identical, yes, and yet only one contains cyanide."
"A deadly substitution, performed with precision. The question is, who had the opportunity?" Sir Reginald shifted in his seat, frowning. "The whole affair is ghastly. The servants set out the drinks before dinner, as they always do. I cannot
"Believe one of my guests would tamper with them." Poirot turned to the assembled group. "Yet tampered they were. Mr. Greaves never drank brandy, did he?" A murmur rippled through the room. Lady Carrington, pale and rigid, shook her head. "No, he preferred wine. He was quite particular about it." Poirot nodded. "Alors, that is the crux of the matter. Someone ensured that he drank from the poisoned glass instead." Hastings exhaled. "Then the murder wasn't random. It was meant for him, specifically. Précisément." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Now we must examine who had the means to switch the drinks. I have reason to believe that only a few people were close enough to the tray in those crucial
moments." He turned toward Evelyn Carrington, who stood near the fireplace, her hands clasped tightly before her. Her eyes darted away as Poirot studied her. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "I believe you were among the last to approach the drinks before Mr. Greaves took his." Evelyn's breath caught. She hesitated, a flush creeping up her neck. Yes, I suppose I was, but I didn't touch them."
Lady Carrington stirred beside her. "Evelyn, dear, surely you recall? You brought me a glass of sherry just before we sat down." A fresh silence fell. Poirot's gaze did not waver. "Indeed? Then you did handle the tray, mademoiselle?" Evelyn's fingers twisted in the fabric of her skirt. "Only for a moment. I didn't switch anything. I wouldn't—" Poirot observed her keenly. "But you hesitated just now. Why?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Lady Carrington reached for her, but she pulled away. Because I don't remember. Everything was moving so fast. People were
speaking, and I... She stopped abruptly. Poirot took a step closer, his voice low and even. Mademoiselle, if you saw something, you must tell us. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut. I didn't see anything. I mean, not exactly.
But I had the oddest feeling that something was wrong. Sir Reginald's brow furrowed. Explain yourself, Evelyn. She swallowed hard. It was just before we all took our drinks. I had poured a sherry for my aunt, but as I turned,
I thought I saw someone else near the tray, just for a moment. I didn't think anything of it then. Poirot's voice softened. Who, mademoiselle?
She hesitated. I don't know. It was only the briefest glimpse, but someone was there moving quickly. Hastings leaned in. A man? A woman? Evelyn pressed her lips together. A man, I think. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. You are certain? She hesitated. Not entirely. It was so fast. Poirot did not push further. Instead, he turned back to the drinks cabinet, considering the possibilities. If Evelyn had noticed someone near the drinks, even briefly, it meant there had been an opportunity for the switch. But who would have taken such a risk in full view of the others? Hastings let out a breath. Poirot, do you think the killer intended to frame Evelyn? Poirot's eyes gleamed. No, mon ami. If Evelyn were meant to be the scapegoat, the killer would have ensured the evidence pointed more clearly in her direction. No, this was not about misdirection. It was about precision. Someone wanted Greaves dead, and they executed their plan with remarkable calculation. He turned back to Evelyn. Mademoiselle, one more question. When you turned and saw this figure near the tray, was there anything unusual? A movement? An action? Evelyn frowned, as though reaching back into a distant memory. Then slowly, her eyes widened. Yes. I remember now. They weren't taking a drink. They were holding something just for a moment. Poirot's expression sharpened. What
was it? She swallowed. A small object. I didn't see it clearly, but it might have been a vial. A murmur rippled through the room. Hastings straightened. Good heavens, then they were carrying the poison with them.
Poirot exhaled, his mind working swiftly. A vial, carried and concealed. The act must have taken mere seconds. It suggested a person of confidence, of control. But who among them possessed such poise? Lady Carrington reached for Evelyn's hand. My dear, you should sit down. Evelyn obeyed, but her hands still trembled in her lap. Poirot's gaze swept the room. The tension had shifted, settling thickly upon the guests. Suspicion curled through the air. One of them had committed murder. Poirot smoothed his lapels. Mesdames et messieurs, we are close. The truth is within reach. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. And I do not think our killer will be able to hide much longer. The room remained silent, the fire crackling in the hearth. In the far corner, a single glass rested upon the tray, untouched since the fateful night. Poirot's
eyes lingered on it. The answer, he murmured, is already before us.
Chapter 9. The Dead Don't Lie. The revelation struck like a thunderclap. Greaves, no Charles Linwood, had been living a lie. Not the shrewd businessman he had claimed to be, but an investigator operating under an assumed identity. Poirot stood in the centre of the drawing-room, hands neatly clasped before him, his mind assembling the pieces with the precision of a master clockmaker. Lady Carrington's voice trembled. A missing woman, but what could that possibly have to do with Greaves, with Mr. Linwood's death? Poirot's little grey cells whirred. Everything, madame. One does not assume a false identity and dig into another's secrets without consequence. No, no. Mr. Linwood was a man who knew too much, and now he is dead. Sir Reginald cleared his throat. You're suggesting that this missing woman is somehow tied to his murder? Poirot inclined his head. It is not merely
A suggestion, monsieur. It is a certainty.
someone in this house did not wish for Mr. Linwood to succeed in his investigation, and so he was silenced. A heavy silence descended upon the room. The fire crackled in the hearth, but no one spoke. Hastings shifted uncomfortably. I say, Poirot, this makes it rather a different case, doesn't it? Before we thought it was just a matter of personal grievance, but now it's something far larger. Poirot turned to him, his expression unreadable. Oui, mon ami, the scope has changed. This was not a crime of passion, but one of necessity. Someone feared what Mr. Linwood would uncover. Evelyn Carrington sat rigid in her chair, her face pale. Poirot watched her closely. Mademoiselle, tell me, had you ever met Mr. Linwood before this week? She blinked rapidly. No, never. Why do you ask? Poirot's voice remained measured. Because you were the last person to see him alive. You handled the drinks and you noticed someone near the tray before the poison was administered. A flicker of distress crossed her face. That doesn't mean I knew him. Poirot merely observed her, his silence drawing forth the tension in the room like a taut wire. Lady Carrington placed a protective hand on Evelyn's arm. You mustn't accuse her unfairly, Monsieur Poirot. Surely you don't believe she— Non, madame, Poirot interrupted gently. I do not believe Mademoiselle poisoned the drink, but I do believe she may know something more than she realizes. Evelyn swallowed, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. I don't know anything about a missing woman. Poirot studied her carefully, then turned to the others. Then let us consider, mes amis. Who among us would? His eyes moved deliberately across the room. Sir Reginald's face remained unreadable, though his fingers drummed against the armrest of his chair. Lady Carrington's expression was carefully composed, though a flicker of unease danced in her eyes. Evelyn had turned her gaze to the floor, avoiding his scrutiny. And then there was Geoffrey Endicott, seated stiffly at the far end of the room, his face slightly pale. Mr. Endicott, Poirot said suddenly. The man flinched, his head snapping up. Yes? You were acquainted with Mr. Linwood before this week, were you not? A ripple of surprise went through the room. Endicott hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly before he composed himself. Why do you say that? Poirot's voice was smooth. Because I noticed your reaction upon his arrival. It was subtle, but unmistakable. You knew him? Endicott hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. Then with a heavy breath he nodded. Yes, I knew him. Years ago, Hastings
Sat forward. Good heavens, man, why didn't you say so earlier?
Endicott's mouth twisted slightly. Because it didn't seem relevant. We weren't close. I knew him back when he was still Charles Linwood. But I hadn't seen him in years. Poirot's voice remained even. And how precisely did you know him? Endicott exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words. He was investigating something, a case, many years ago. He asked me a few questions, nothing more. We weren't friends, but I recognized him at once when he arrived here, calling himself Greaves. Poirot's gaze did not waver. And what was he investigating, monsieur? Endicott hesitated. Then, at last, he said, the disappearance
Of a woman named Margaret Holloway. The name fell into the silence like a stone dropped into a still pond. Poirot nodded slightly.
Margaret Holloway. He turned back to the others. "Does the name mean anything to you?" A beat passed. Then slowly, Lady Carrington's complexion lost its colour. Her fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. Sir Reginald's expression darkened. "That's quite enough, Poirot," he said gruffly. "This is an appalling line of questioning." Poirot lifted a brow. "Ah, then the name does mean something to you, Sir Reginald?" The man's jaw clenched. "No, I simply find it distasteful to dredge up old scandals."
"Old scandals," Poirot echoed. "Then you admit there was a scandal?" Sir Reginald exhaled sharply. "Margaret Holloway was a foolish young woman who disappeared nearly 20 years ago. She was a governess, worked for a family I knew. Hastings."
Frowned. "And she was never found?" Reginald shook his head. "No, she vanished without a trace." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And what was the scandal exactly?" Reginald hesitated, then let out a weary sigh. It was rumoured that she had been involved with her employer. An indiscretion, nothing more. When she disappeared, people assumed she had fled in disgrace. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "But what if she had not fled? What if she had been made to disappear?" A hush fell over the room. Evelyn, her breath shallow, whispered, "Do you think she was murdered?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward. "Margaret Holloway vanishes. Years later, an investigator takes up her case. That investigator is murdered before he can reveal what he has found. Is that not très intéressant?" The room seemed to close in upon itself. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows. Sir Reginald's face was taut with something unreadable. Lady Carrington looked stricken. Evelyn's hands trembled in her lap. Poirot's voice was quiet, yet firm. "Someone in this house does not want Margaret Holloway's disappearance solved. Someone is willing to kill to keep the past buried." Endicott swallowed hard. "And you think the answer is here?" Poirot nodded. "Oh, may we? The dead do not lie, mon ami, and neither do the guilty, for long." Chapter 10. The false confession. Poirot regarded Lady Margaret with a steady gaze, his fingertips pressed together, as if he were contemplating a delicate puzzle. Her confession had sent ripples through the household, yet he remained unimpressed. Hastings, on the other hand, was quite taken aback. "Well, Poirot," he said, pacing near the fireplace, "I fail to see how you can dismiss this so easily." "The lady has confessed after all." Poirot gave a small shake of his head. "And yet, mon ami, do you not see? A confession so sudden, so convenient, should never be taken at face value. Lady Margaret is not a fool. She knows that by confessing, she shifts the focus away from the true culprit." Lady Margaret sat in the high-backed chair, her hands folded primly in her lap, but her eyes flickered with something between resignation and quiet defiance. Poirot leaned forward. "Madame, you claim that Greaves was blackmailing you over
An affair, no less. And yet I ask myself, why now? If he had leverage over you, why would he demand retribution after all these years?
And more importantly, why would you choose to silence him in such an elaborate manner when a mere payment would have sufficed?" Lady Margaret's lips parted, but no words emerged. A faint tremor ran through her hands, though she quickly masked it by clasping them together. Hastings folded his arms. "But Poirot, if not her, then who?" Poirot stood abruptly and adjusted his cuffs. "That, mon ami, is the question. And I believe the answer lies not in what we see, but in what we overlook." Turned to Lady Margaret. "You are protecting someone, are you not?" Her breath caught, and for a brief moment, true fear flashed in her eyes. Poirot pressed on. Perhaps someone you care for? Someone whose involvement in this crime you cannot bear to see uncovered? Lady Margaret hesitated for only a moment, before her mask of composure returned. I have told you all I intend to, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot sighed, but did not press further. Instead, he turned back to Hastings. Come, mon ami, there is much to be done. The pieces are all before us, and yet one final detail eludes me. We must look again, carefully, at what Greaves, or should I say Charles Linwood, was investigating before his untimely demise. As they stepped into the dimly lit corridor, Poirot's keen eyes flickered with purpose. The true murderer had been watching, anticipating every move he made. But even the cleverest of criminals made mistakes. Poirot intended to find them. Chapter 11. The Vanishing. Key Poirot turned the small brass key over in his hand, his sharp eyes reflecting a glint of satisfaction. Hastings, peering over his shoulder, frowned in confusion. "But why hide it in the clock, Poirot?" he asked. "If the murderer wanted to dispose of it, why not throw it into the river or bury it?" Poirot tapped the key against his palm. "Ah, mon ami, that is precisely what interests me. To dispose of an object is simple, but to hide it in plain sight, that is the mark of a mind that seeks to misdirect. The key was meant to be found, but only at the right moment." Hastings furrowed his brow. "You mean the murderer wanted us to find it?" "Perhaps not us, but someone, we." Poirot slipped the key into his pocket and turned toward Sir Reginald, who stood stiffly by the fireplace, his expression unreadable. "Tell me, Sir Reginald," Poirot said, his voice smooth but firm. "There is an old cottage on your estate, is there not?" Reginald stiffened. "Yes, it's been unused for years." "Why?" Poirot merely smiled. "Then let us see if your abandoned cottage has been so abandoned after all." The night air was damp as Poirot, Hastings, and Sir Reginald approached the cottage. A faint mist clung to the ground, swirling around their feet as they stepped along the overgrown path. The structure itself was small and time-worn, its shutters hanging crookedly, the wood showing signs of rot. Poirot reached the door and inserted the key. It turned smoothly in the lock. Hastings held his breath as Poirot pushed the door open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The interior was dark and stale, dust thick on the floor. But Poirot's sharp gaze immediately locked onto a particular detail. The dust near the fireplace was disturbed. Someone had been here recently. "Light, Hastings," Poirot murmured. Hastings struck a match, and as the glow flickered across the room, Poirot moved swiftly, his fingers trailing over the mantelpiece before stopping at a small wooden box. With careful precision, he lifted the lid. Inside lay a bundle of letters, yellowed with age. Poirot picked up the topmost one and scanned its contents. As he read, his expression darkened. "Mon Dieu," he whispered. "It is as I feared." "What is it?" Hastings asked, peering over his shoulder. Poirot handed him the letter. The handwriting was elegant but urgent. "I cannot stay silent any longer. If
anything happens to me, you must know the truth. The man you trust is not who he claims to be." It was signed with only the initial M. Hastings felt a chill run down his spine.
"You think this is connected to Greaves' murder?" Poirot nodded. "We, Hastings, the missing woman, the false identities, the key, everything is entwined. And now I believe I know exactly who has orchestrated this tragedy." Before Hastings could respond, a sudden noise echoed from outside. The sound of hurried footsteps, then the distinct click of a gun being cocked. Poirot's eyes flashed. "It seems, mon ami, that the murderer has has realized we are too close to the truth. Chapter 12. The cottage of shadows, the tension in the air, was thick as the echo of hurried footsteps outside the cottage faded into the night. Hastings, his nerves frayed, cast a glance at Poirot, who stood utterly still, his head slightly tilted as if listening for something more. Then, with a composed gesture, Poirot stepped away from the open box of letters and turned toward the darkened doorway. "We are not alone, mon ami," he murmured. Hastings swallowed. Should we be concerned?" Poirot's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "Concerned, yes. Afraid? No. The murderer is growing desperate, and when a criminal grows desperate, they make mistakes." Without further hesitation, Poirot knelt by the chest and carefully lifted a stack of old photographs from beneath the letters. The edges were curled with time, the images faded, but as Poirot shuffled through them, he paused on one in particular. His fingers tightened around it ever so slightly. Hastings, peering over his shoulder, frowned. "I say, Poirot, that chap looks familiar." Indeed, in the center of the photograph stood a younger version of someone they both knew, someone whose presence at the estate had seemed, until now, unremarkable. Poirot exhaled softly. It is always the past, Hastings, that holds the key to the present. Before Hastings could respond, a sound outside made them both tense. The rustle of leaves, the creak of a shifting floorboard on the veranda. Poirot's lips pressed together in a firm line. "We must act quickly," he whispered, tucking the photograph inside his pocket. "I have what I need." Moving with haste, but careful precision, Poirot closed the chest and dusted off his hands. "Come, Hastings. The time has come to reveal the truth." The walk back to the house was tense. Every shadow felt like a lurking figure, every whisper of wind against the trees, a breath of something unseen. By the time they reached the grand entrance of the estate, Hastings' nerves were stretched thin. Inside, the drawing-room was dimly lit, the grandfather clock ticking away in steady, rhythmic beats. Poirot, moving with characteristic decisiveness, rang the small bell on the side table. Moments later, Sir Reginald entered, his expression wary. Behind him trailed Lady Margaret, her face pale, and Charles, the butler, his usual composure slightly frayed. Poirot stood by the fireplace, his small frame almost delicate against the grand setting. He tapped his fingers together. "My friends," he began, his voice smooth yet commanding, "it is time for truth to come into the light. We have uncovered something most extraordinary, a link between the past and the present, between a vanished woman and a man who was not who he claimed to be." Sir Reginald's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Poirot withdrew the photograph from his pocket and handed it to him. "Do you recognize anyone in this picture, monsieur?" Reginald's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the faded photograph to his eyes. His face went slack, then carefully blank. He said nothing. Poirot turned to Lady Margaret. "And you, madame?" She hesitated, then leaned forward to look. The moment her eyes fell on the image, a small gasp escaped her lips. It can't be," she whispered. Hastings, eager but still puzzled, cleared his throat. "Come now, what is it?" Poirot folded his arms. "This, Hastings, is a photograph from nearly 20 years ago, and in it you see a young man, a man who today resides under this very roof." Lady Margaret covered her mouth. Sir Reginald's grip on the photograph tightened. Hastings' eyes darted between them all, confusion giving way to realization. "Good heavens," he breathed. "But that's—" "Yes, Hastings," Poirot cut in smoothly. "The man we know as Charles, the butler." A stunned silence filled the room. Charles, standing by the door, let out a slow exhale. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice steady. "I do not know what you mean." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but you do. You see, you are not merely a butler. You are someone with a past, someone who once had another life, another name. And it is that past which is at the heart of this mystery." Charles's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Poirot moved forward, his steps measured, his voice gentle, but firm. "The letters we found in the cottage speak of a terrible truth. A truth that Greaves, or should I say, Charles Linwood, had uncovered. And that truth is why he was killed." Lady Margaret let out a soft, involuntary sob. Poirot turned, back to Charles. "You have spent years hiding from something. But the past, mon ami, always finds a way to return." Charles's hands clenched at his sides. "And what precisely do you believe my past contains, monsieur?" Poirot's eyes locked onto his. "Murder," he said simply. A sharp intake of breath from
Lady Margaret. A shifting of weight from Sir Reginald. Hastings, standing near the window, was frozen in place. Charles held Poirot's gaze, and then, after a long pause, he laughed, a short, bitter sound.
"Bravo, Monsieur Poirot," he said softly. "You truly do see everything, don't you?" Poirot inclined his head. "It is my business to see, monsieur, and now the time has come for you to tell us what truly happened all those years ago." The room was silent, waiting. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Charles turned and reached into his pocket. Hastings tensed. Poirot remained still. The truth was about to come to light. Chapter 13. The trap is set. The tension in the house was palpable. Poirot's announcement had sent ripples of unease through its inhabitants, and now, as the drawing-room filled with wary faces, Hastings could almost hear the unspoken questions swirling in the air. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill of suspicion that had settled over them all. Sir Reginald stood near the mantelpiece, his usual self-assurance slightly frayed. Lady Margaret sat stiffly on the settee, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Young Edward shifted in his chair, his expression carefully neutral, while Miss Townsend, the governess, sat ramrod straight, her eyes darting between Poirot and Charles, the butler, who had positioned himself near the door. Poirot, standing before them all with an air of quiet authority, allowed the silence to stretch a moment longer before speaking. "My friends," he began, "tonight we reach the end of our little mystery. The threads they have unravelled, and now the pattern is clear." Hastings noted the flicker of unease that crossed Charles's face, the way Edward's fingers tapped against the armrest, the slight tremor in Lady Margaret's hands, all small signs, but to Poirot they were everything. "I have said that I have found the ultimate clue," Poirot continued, his voice smooth, "and indeed it is so. But before I reveal it, let us consider where we stand." He turned slightly, addressing them all in turn. "We have a man murdered, Greaves, the solicitor, who knew something, perhaps too much. A missing key found in a clock leading to a hidden cottage. And within that cottage, letters and photographs revealing a past that someone has tried very hard to conceal." His gaze swept the room, lingering just a second too long on Charles, who stood rigid, his fingers twitching at his side. Poirot's voice softened. "But the most curious thing, mes amis, is not what was found, but what was missing. A letter, a single letter, removed from the chest before we arrived." A murmur ran through the room. Hastings, who had not heard this before, started. "I say, Poirot, how do you know a letter was missing?" Poirot's lips curled slightly. "Ah, Hastings, because the box was too perfect. Old letters, yellowed with time, stacked in precise bundles, except for one space, just large enough for a missing envelope. Someone had taken it before we arrived." The silence that followed was heavy. Poirot turned suddenly, fixing Charles with a piercing gaze. "And you, monsieur, you reached into your pocket last night when I confronted you. What was it you held?" Charles hesitated. I don't know what you mean." "Oh, but you do," Poirot said gently. "The missing letter, perhaps?" "The final proof of what Greaves had discovered?" Charles's jaw tightened. "I had nothing." Poirot nodded, as though considering the response. Then, with an air of casual ease, he walked toward the writing desk near the window. Slowly, deliberately, he picked up a silver letter opener. "You see, my friends," he said conversationally, "there is something very interesting about guilt. When one is accused, the innocent demand proof. The guilty, they watch." His eyes flicked up, just in time to catch Charles's involuntary glance toward the small desk drawer. Poirot smiled. "Ah," he murmured. "Then it is there." A sharp intake of breath from Charles, a flicker of something dark in Edward's gaze. Lady Margaret turned to her husband, her expression stricken. With an elegant motion, Poirot reached for the drawer and pulled it open. Inside, resting atop a stack of old correspondence, was a single envelope, its edges worn as though handled many times. Poirot lifted it delicately. "Shall we see what was worth killing for?" No one spoke as he slid the letter from its casing. Poirot read it silently, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, he turned it toward them. Sir Reginald swore under his breath. Lady Margaret let out a small, choked cry. Edward rose abruptly from his chair, but Poirot lifted a hand. "Sit, monsieur, it is too late now." The letter was brief, an old document confirming a scandal long buried, a name change, a new identity, and the reason why Greaves had been silenced. Poirot exhaled softly. The past always catches up, does it not? He looked up, his sharp gaze meeting Edward's. Edward's composure faltered. His fingers curled against the chair's wooden arm. You think I had something to do with this?" Poirot's voice was quiet. "I know you did." A moment of stillness. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, Edward lunged forward as though to grab the letter from Poirot's grasp. But Poirot was prepared. He stepped aside smoothly, and Hastings, reacting on instinct, caught Edward by the arms. "Let me go!" Edward snarled, struggling. "You don't understand." Poirot remained calm. "I understand perfectly. You killed Greaves because he was going to expose the truth about your family's past. He knew who you really were, who Charles really was, and you could not allow that." Edward's breath came fast. He was shaking now, the fight draining from him. Sir Reginald looked away, his face lined with something between fury and regret. Lady Margaret buried her face in her hands. Poirot spoke one last time, his voice gentle but firm. "It is over." The truth, at last, had come to light. Chapter 14. The murderer exposed. The room remained charged with tension. Edward's struggle had ceased, and he stood panting, held firmly by Hastings, his face pale and glistening with sweat. Sir Reginald's hands trembled slightly as he clenched them into fists, his gaze locked on the letter that had sealed his son's fate. Lady Margaret sat motionless, her expression stricken, but it was not Edward whom Poirot was watching now. It was Evelyn Carrington, though for years she had been known by another name. Miss Townsend, the governess, had not moved. She sat frozen in her chair, her usually composed face unreadable, her hands still neatly folded in her lap. But Poirot's little grey cells had worked their magic, and now the final veil was about to be lifted. Poirot turned to her with quiet deliberation. "Mademoiselle, you have been remarkably silent this evening, perhaps too silent." The woman's fingers twitched, the only betrayal of her nerves. "I don't see what you mean, Monsieur Poirot." Her voice was steady, measured, but Poirot
merely smiled as though he had expected such a response. "Oh, but I think you do, shall we say it plainly? You are not Miss Townsend at all." A ripple of shock passed through the room.
Even Edward, whose fate seemed sealed, turned to stare at the governess in astonishment. Charles, the butler, shifted uncomfortably near the door. "That's absurd," he muttered. "She's been with the family for years." Poirot turned sharply toward him. "Yes, indeed, Charles. And you, monsieur, have been most useful in providing a false sense of security, have you not?" Poirot's gaze bored into him, and Charles paled. "Perhaps you did not know the truth, but you helped to conceal it all the same." He pivoted back to the governess. "Or shall I say Evelyn Carrington?" A long silence followed. Then, with excruciating slowness, Evelyn's lips curled into a thin, humourless smile. "Well," she murmured, "it seems I underestimated you, Monsieur Poirot." The confession was not an admission of guilt, at least not yet, but it was—
"Enough!" Hastings let out a breath. "Good Lord, Poirot, you mean to say—" Poirot inclined his head. "Indeed, my friend, she was never Miss Townsend at all."
She was Evelyn Carrington, the missing woman whom Greaves had recognized, and that recognition sealed his fate. Lady Margaret made a strangled noise, half rising from the settee. "But that's impossible. Miss Townsend has been in this household for years, oui, madame. And yet, did you ever truly know her past?" Poirot's tone was almost gentle. "Did you ever question why she never spoke of her family? Why she avoided photographs? Or why she refused to travel beyond the village?" Lady Margaret faltered, and Poirot pressed on. "Mademoiselle Carrington vanished years ago, but she did not disappear. She merely changed her name, her identity. A governess is, after all, the perfect disguise. Who questions the background of a woman who devotes herself to the education of children? She had found the perfect refuge until fate intervened." Evelyn's expression remained unreadable. "You claim that Greaves recognized me," she said coolly. "But if that were true, why did he not simply expose me?" Poirot's smile was thin. "Because, mademoiselle, he had no proof at first."
"But he suspected, and when a man suspects, he investigates. He must have found something, an old document perhaps, or a photograph that confirmed his doubts. That was when you acted."
She said nothing, but Poirot continued, his voice growing softer, more deliberate. "He was poisoned, you see? A subtle thing. His drink tampered with while he was distracted. And then, of course, the clever misdirection, the missing key, the planted clues, all leading us down false trails." Poirot's dark eyes gleamed. "But, as always, there was one flaw, one tiny detail that did not fit." Evelyn's mask slipped just a fraction. Poirot turned slightly, addressing the room at large. "When I examined Greaves's body, I noted something very peculiar. His watch had stopped at 9:17. Sir Reginald frowned. "What of it?" Poirot spread his hands. "It is a small thing, perhaps, but it told me everything. The poison worked swiftly, but not instantly. He must have felt unwell before he collapsed. enough so that he might have glanced at his watch.
In those last moments, Poirot paused. Now let me ask you, mes amis, at 9:17, where was Miss Townsend? A hush fell over the room. Hastings paled. By Jove, she was bringing in the tea.
Poirot nodded gravely. Yes, mon ami, and she was the last person to see Greaves alive. The governess's breath came just a fraction faster now. Her hands had tightened in her lap, but she remained composed. Poirot, ever patient, delivered the final blow, and then, of course, there was the handwriting. Evelyn stiffened. What do you mean? The forged note, Poirot said softly. The one we found among Greaves' things, the one intended to throw us off the scent. It was clever, mademoiselle, but not clever enough. The slant, the formation.
Of the letters? They were remarkably similar to something else I had seen. He paused. Your own handwriting. A silence followed, heavy and inescapable. Evelyn's fingers clenched, and for the first time there was something like desperation in her eyes. You have no real proof, she said, but there was less conviction in her voice now. Poirot stepped
closer. No, then tell me, mademoiselle, why did you burn the final letter? She flinched, ever so slightly. Poirot's voice was a whisper now. Ah, you did not expect me to notice, did you? But the ashes in the fireplace told their own story. The room seemed to close in around her. Sir Reginald had gone pale. Lady, Margaret looked stricken. Hastings' grip on Edward had loosened as he stared in stunned disbelief. Evelyn exhaled sharply, shaking her head. It's over, then? Poirot nodded. Oui, mademoiselle, it is over. For the first time that evening her composure cracked. There was no wild attempt to flee, no final plea of innocence, only a slow, shuddering sigh as she straightened her shoulders. Very well, she murmured. You win, Monsieur Poirot. A terrible silence filled the room. Then, as if released from a spell, Sir Reginald turned away, rubbing a weary hand over his face. Lady Margaret let out a quiet sob. Hastings, ever the soldier, simply exhaled. Poirot, ever poised, straightened his cuffs. The past, he murmured, has a way of catching up to us all. The truth, at last, had come to light. Chapter 15. The grand denouement. Poirot stood before the assembled guests in the grand drawing-room, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. The fire crackled in the hearth, its flickering glow casting long shadows across the tense faces of those present. Evelyn Carrington sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped together in her lap. Lady Margaret clutched her pearls, her breathing shallow, while Colonel Whitmore's fingers drummed against the armrest of his chair. Even Hastings, ever the eager observer, leaned forward in anticipation. My friends, Poirot began, his voice smooth and measured. It is time for the truth to be revealed. For too long we have been ensnared in a web of deception. The death of Greaves, or rather Charles Linwood, was no crime of passion, nor was it a matter of simple blackmail. No, it was a carefully planned murder, one designed to conceal a much older crime. There was a murmur in the room, but Poirot lifted a hand, silencing it. Let us consider, mes amis, what we now know. Charles Linwood was a man of great persistence. He sought a missing woman, a woman who had vanished from society many years ago. He believed she was here, hiding in plain sight, and he was correct. All eyes turned to Evelyn, but she did not
flinch, Poirot continued. Mademoiselle Carrington, or should I say, the former Elizabeth Harcourt, wife to the late Arthur Harcourt, and heiress to a considerable fortune. You disappeared after your husband's sudden death, presumed drowned.
In a boating accident, but the truth, it seems, was far more sinister. Evelyn's lips parted slightly, her composure faltering. The death of Arthur Harcourt was no accident. "You murdered him!" Gasps filled the room. Colonel Whitmore shot to his feet. "That's preposterous!" he barked. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Is it, mon colonel?" Charles Linwood suspected as much. He must have recognized something, a detail, a mannerism, a photograph. And so he confronted you. You could not allow him to reveal the truth, and so you acted swiftly, poisoning his drink and planting false leads to misdirect us. Evelyn's hands trembled. "You have no proof," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Poirot's moustache twitched with satisfaction. "Ah, but I do. The letters in the cottage, hidden away so carefully, tell a story most revealing. Letters from Arthur expressing his suspicions that his life was in danger. And the missing key, found within the old clock, led us to a box
of documents proving your true identity. You may have changed your name, mademoiselle, but the past is not so easily erased."
Silence gripped the room like a vice. Lady Margaret's face had gone pale, while Hastings shook his head in astonishment. Evelyn sat motionless, the weight of Poirot's words pressing upon her. Then slowly she exhaled. "Very well," she said at last, her voice low but steady. "You are right, Monsieur Poirot. I did kill Arthur. He was a cruel man. I saw no other way." Hastings let out an audible breath. "Good heavens!" Poirot gave a small, almost sorrowful nod. "Perhaps, mademoiselle, but one crime begets another, and now justice must be served." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, then lifted her chin. "Yes," she murmured, "I suppose it must." The room remained heavy with unspoken words as the truth settled upon them all. Poirot straightened his cuffs and turned to Hastings with a small smile. "It is always the little grey cells, mon ami. They never fail me." Hastings could only shake his head in wonder, as Poirot, ever the meticulous investigator, took a slow sip of his tisane, his work, once again, complete.